Okay, good afternoon. This is Allison Wilson. I'm going to go ahead and call our meeting to order. I'm here with you today because our normal fearless leader, Sarah, is enjoying some time in Costa Rica with her family. So good for her. Again, Allison Wilson, I'm with the Texas Workforce Commission, and I just want to welcome the small number of work group participants we have here with us today. So we are doing this meeting as a Zoom webinar, and we have the council members and presenters and agency staff on today as panelists. Any members of the public that are participating are only able to be in listen-only mode. Just wanted to remind everyone who's on here as a panelist to ensure that your device is on mute when you're not speaking. Chelsea will mute you if you don't remember to mute yourself. And also Chelsea Moore with Texas Workforce Commission also is going to serve as our facilitator today. I also wanted to remind you that before you speak to please state your name. Just for the record, we are recording this. Public comment, there was opportunity to submit that. The period closed yesterday at 5 p.m. If you're joining the call now and wish to give an oral comment, you are still able to do that. You just need to email Megan Schneider, and she just dropped the instructions for that into the chat. Okay, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started on our agenda. And our first item is to review the meeting minutes from our November meeting. So those were attached in your email and to the calendar invitation. So if you would take a look at those, and I'll give you a moment to look at them, and then ask if anyone has any edits or changes they'd like. Okay. Hearing none. Do I have a motion to approve those meeting minutes?
So moved. Kirsten Schwab, Texas PBO.
Thank you. So Kirsten made the motion to approve them. Do we have a second?
I second.
Thank you, Travis. Okay, Travis Duke seconded that. So all those in favor, I guess we will do we want to do a roll call vote, Chelsea, or do we want to just go through the list of who's on here?
Yeah, we can just go through the list. We'll
Yeah.
Just know that it's fine that we don't have a quorum. So for consistency, when I call your name, please reply for, against, or abstain. So Sarah Abrahams, Weldon Beard, April Crawford, Travis Duke,
Here.
David Fagan, Kim Coffrin, Tori Lee,
4.
Kirsten Schwab,
4.
Catherine Sibley, Laura Varnell, and Allison Wilson.
4.
Great. So the motion to approve the November 2022 meeting minutes has carried. So
All right.
I'll get it back to you.
Thank you. All right, so our next agenda item is to take a look at the draft early childhood data landscape that Third Sector Intelligence has put together. So as a reminder, 3SI did present to us at our October meeting. And since then, they've continued to work with staff at the various agencies to create this preliminary draft of a data landscape of our early childhood data. Also, as a reminder, this was work that was donated to the state from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in September. And we are planning to share the final data landscape alongside the ECIDS roadmap that we are developing very early next year. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests here from 3SI. We have Chris Strauss-Clark, Ross Gilliland, Derek Thomas from 3SI. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you guys.
Okay, I'm happy to kick us off. Can everyone hear me? Okay,
Yes.
just checking. All right, and I can't control the slides, so I'll just chirp. Feel free to advance when you're ready. But yeah, we're here just to walk you through very high level of our data landscape. And so that's going to include kind of a reminder about what the scope of our engagement is, the sort of process that we used, and some of our initial findings. And it's all at a pretty high level. The report is like 40 pages, and we have maybe 15 minutes. So we're keeping it high, but I'll look forward to any detailed questions that come up. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide.
So can you all hear me okay? Ross, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
I can hear you now.
perfect. Just checking. Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the scope of our engagement, we've done a lot of things, but it's important to note that there's a lot of things we didn't do. And this is certainly a preliminary analysis that we've performed, right? So we were meant to do this at a high level, just looking at the systems that exist, trying to sort of map the data that's available to the data that we think you might need in order to address some of the foundational use cases. So we'll talk about that quite a bit. But all of this is being done at sort of this level that doesn't entail any access to actual data, right? So we're just really looking at sort of like what we call metadata, or like documentation on systems, interviews with agency staff, that kind of thing. Nevertheless, there are some high-level takeaways for sure in terms of data availability and some of our assessment of gaps in needed data. So we'll get to that briefly, but just wanted to kind of lay that out for everyone before we dive in. So if you advance to the next slide, please. So this is the process at a high level and kind of where the landscape fit into the pre-existing work. So as you all know, there's sort of foundational use cases that Texas has established. And 3SI really didn't develop those. We've kind of inherited those for this project, but they are foundational, and indeed, our landscape is kind of approaching the availability of early childhood data in Texas through the lens of those foundational use cases. So we kind of translate that to needed data, and then there's kind of this like sifting and winnowing of understanding the needed data, then the needed agencies that are going to be central to this, and then ultimately engaging with those agencies and other staff to get documentation and kind of get a handle on what data is likely to be available, and then analyzing all of that and producing a summary report. So it's important to note that I could have told you this last year before looking at any documentation, that not all the data is ever there for any state. So there, of course, are mitigation strategies to overcome some of those things, like all states have to deal with that. Not at all in the scope of this engagement for us to kind of get into that. So this is really more just of a factual accounting of what data is there and what data is not. Okay, so I think we can proceed to the next slide now. So then going into each of those steps, again, these are the foundational use cases, although I think I heard maybe they're called business cases now. I'll leave it to Texas to sort of clarify all of that. But yeah, the use cases, they start very big, right? Like, what's the total population of children, families, birth to 5? Which of those families are eligible for different services? And then what's the population of those children and families that are actually being served? And then lastly, which of those children could be eligible but are not, that kind of thing. So we've taken those use cases really as gospel and have distilled from those the data that we think would be necessary to actually address those use cases. So that is in this next slide. Yep. And we're really looking at 3 broad categories of data. So the first one is of the children that are served, we need to know, of the programs that we're considering, we need to know which children are served, what providers are serving those children. That's just like the most basic thing. The second bullet is really about our ability to match across disparate systems. So, you might have child level data from a couple systems, and that's great. But are you able to sort of produce these unduplicated counts, those kinds of things? It's a common challenge. So that's an important lens, is like, how much can we really integrate these data? And then lastly, gets to that broad question of all children, right, including those that are unserved. The spoiler alert really here is like, we're talking about kids that are not necessarily always represented in administrative data systems, but that is clearly a part of what would be needed to reach those first couple questions, the first 2 foundational use cases around the entire child population. So yeah, basically, again, we're bringing this lens then of, these are the foundational use cases, is the data you'd need to address those use cases, and everything that we've looked at in this exercise really is in relationship to those use cases. So I'll put in a reminder later, but an important caveat is that, there are other use cases that Texas has, and if we wanted to address some of those, if Texas wanted to address some of those and assess availability of data to meet other use cases, like say one around like workforce data, that is something that 3SI did not perform, or that wasn't like top of mind as we were going through these different these systems. Okay, so I can go to the next slide. Oh yeah,
Rob,
go ahead, Chris.
Can I just on that
Mhm.
point? The good news for Texas is well, first of all, we totally agree with the foundational use cases. We think those are great use cases, and we're excited that Texas has done that work. In terms of adding data later, the really key part is to actually establish those 3 things in the previous slide, which if you have data at the level of the child and at the level of the provider, then when you get to further data sets, whether it be teachers or whether it be assessments or whatever it is, it's much easier to attach that data to the provider, or if you have characteristics about the children, to attach it to the child, because you have it at the lowest level of granularity and it's integrated. So the really good news for Texas is you start with a really solid base at the, again, the lowest level of detail, and then that will allow that will allow Texas to really grow this capability in a dynamic way that is on a solid foundation. So I just wanted to point that out before we go to the next slide. All right, back to you, Ross.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, then having established kind of the general parameters of needed data and the use cases, then we turned our attention to sort of creating a solid list of the agencies or other institutions that we needed to engage with for this effort. So this is the list of kind of the main systems that we prioritized, and you can see, 5 agencies or organizations represented there. That being said, we did talk to some other agencies as well. As a bit of I think in the interview world, people talk about snowball sampling. So, you talk to one person and then they tell you to talk to someone else. And anyway, we kind of chased some of those leads in a way just to, get a somewhat more complete picture. And yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. So in terms of engaging, staff, we were, we kind of had like a kickoff meeting, and, we'd sort of have like a series of interview questions and things like that. And then in most cases, we'd be given documentations from the agency staff. And documentation, again, so we're not looking at real data, but this would be like a data dictionary where it lists all of the data fields and kind of what they are. So we have a sense of what data is collected. Another important thing that we would try to understand, like, is this data that's collected sometimes or all the time? Because we say that a lot with systems where, like, yeah, technically they have a field to store, like, I don't know, child race ethnicity data, but it's only filled in like 30% of the time and it's not required, right? So there's a big difference between whether something is required for anyone for whom it should or could plausibly be required, or if it's just an optional field. So we try to capture that information as well. Yeah, so this is some of the, just a breakdown of some of the documentation, things like that we got. And yeah, I think, you know, there's a footnote there too about, you know, we did collect some initial documentation from some other agencies too. As I mentioned, we kind of snowballed into that. In the interest of time, I might keep us moving. I think the more interesting stuff comes next. Okay, so in terms of general availability, we'll spend some time on this slide, but the first two types of needed data, right? So that's data on served children and providers serving children, as well as data to facilitate matching across disparate systems. We kind of characterize that as medium availability, and I'll go into that in a second. And then in terms of the full child population, it's generally lower. So starting in from the top in terms of the served children and providers, I think for any of the administrative systems that we would expect to have really good like child or provider level data, it seems like that information is there, right? So the reason this is medium and not, you know, high or complete is that there's some administrative data that we just isn't likely to exist. And I think probably the best example is licensed childcare and kids who are not receiving any kind of subsidy. There's really no child level information on those children being surfaced to the state, right? So that's sort of, it's to my knowledge, a ubiquitous challenge that states face, but is nevertheless, you know, not everything that you might need in order to provide perfectly reliable counts of children currently being served. So what that means is there are going to be proxies in some cases, aggregated data. In the case of licensed childcare, licensed capacity, which is not a perfect proxy for children served, but it gives a sort of order of magnitude sense of information about how many children providers are serving in the absence of that child level data. So anyway, we could go into more detail on any of these things, but that's that first category at a high level. And then the second category around sort of information to facilitate matching, that's again, that's medium. I think it would be high if there were what we'd call unique identifiers that were pervasive across all of the systems. And I think there was a question about that at a meeting or two ago. That would certainly make things easier if that data existed. And it doesn't in some cases, but where it doesn't, we did find that there are likely to be common identifiers that, like for instance, on the child side, the common identifier would be like a child's name, date of birth, address, et cetera, things like that. Those identifiers can be used to match across systems. It's not exactly always clean, right? It's what's called fuzzy matching, and there's algorithms and things like that to support it. But it's certainly feasible, and the industry does matching like that all the time. So we found that generally the data to facilitate that at the child and provider level exists to help understand and sort of the intersection of these different systems where children might be represented in multiple systems and ultimately deduplicate across the administrative data sets. And then, yeah, in terms of this last category around the full child population, so this is also, I think, a very consistent challenge that states face, but the administrative data sets that we included for this inventory, they they don't cover all of the children in the state. And so invariably, even in cases where you have really excellent child level data, if a program's serving 20% of the children in the state, then you're going to have the other 80% that just don't have that child level data. And so there are definitely gaps in showing not just the full child population, but also the population that's eligible for different services. So again, we can go into more detail about how we looked, but we ultimately broke that down according to some of the most common dimensions of program eligibility. So like child age, household income, whether their parents and guardians are meeting certain activity requirements, things like that. And so we kind of looked at the reach of administrative systems to kind of model the population characteristics across those and other dimensions. And yeah, overall it's low. So there will be other external data that would need to be included ultimately to address that use case.
Ross, can I
go ahead.
jump in
Please.
here for a second? So I just wanted to just emphasize that this, the subtitle, there are gaps and sometimes significant gaps, especially when it comes to the entire child population. It's totally normal. I can't emphasize how normal this is. And I do want to emphasize that it absolutely does not preclude Texas from pursuing an ESID should it want to. There are definitely strategies available to do that. The fact that you have medium availability on the first two categories is fantastic. This is quite common, and we see this pretty much all the time. So, but it's great that Texas has done a data inventory, so it knows where it stands and what needs to happen. Should it decide to go down the road of an ESID. So, go ahead, Ross. Back to you.
Okay. Yep. I think we just have one more slide. So, I think Chris just kind of underscored this point that's bolded here too. But we certainly, we see that there is, in summary, a lot of data that will be really useful should Texas want to integrate it in something like an ESIDS. And as he just noted, there are gaps. None of those gaps would preclude Texas from going down this road if that's something they want to do. All states face gaps kind of like these. And then just like these final reminders, like I already said it once, but I should say it one more time. These results are preliminary for a couple of reasons. We didn't have access to any actual data. So, it could be that we said something's medium, but it's actually lower because, oh, look at this, these child addresses are terrible or whatever, we've been in the field long enough. Like sometimes there are surprises where data is collected, it's mandatory, but then the data quality itself is actually quite low. So obviously we weren't able to assess that. And then once again, this focus was really on these 4 foundational use cases and not the sort of broader list. And so just another reminder that, we're really talking about feasibility to address those use cases in particular. So I think that's everything we have, and we're happy to open it for questions, and we have some other detailed slides in our appendices, but that's it from us.
Okay, so I'll open it up to the group and ask if anyone has any questions about the data landscape. Okay, don't all talk at once. All right, well.
I'm
Kirsten?
curious, do you look at census data, and what are the pitfalls of looking at census data in terms of population data?
You said what are the what in relation to looking at census
Pitfalls.
data?
Pitfalls. What are the
Pitfalls.
Pitfalls. Thank you.
Great question.
Great question. It is a great question. Well, I can start to answer it, and Chris, Derek, feel free to add. So I think, once again, just to clarify the sort of bounds of our analysis here, we're just looking at Texas's administrative data. So we didn't include census, but that is certainly an obvious choice to try to model population data. There are some general pitfalls. Where to begin? To be concise, it's not totally current. Census data is usually like something like 2 years out of date. And of course, it's just a sample, like the annual census, the American Community Survey, is like a 1% sample survey. And so enough to be statistically valid, I think. But of course, there's error to the estimates that come out of that. Also, the data's probably not, doesn't have the granularity in terms of the sort of child and family level characteristics that would be ideal. So like there aren't ACS summary tables that'll say there are this many kids that are 3 years old between this income and their parents work and don't. Like you kind of have to, it's aggregated in different views, and you can pull that information out. You can kind of tease it out from other sources too. Like there's something called the microdata, but that microdata is also masked at a fairly high geographical level. So it's sort of like there's trade-offs and working with it, but it is certainly a reliable source of information. Chris, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say to add to that, you're right. Census, that is for other states, we use census to fill in that number 3. But you're also right that you have to be careful. It's per Ross's point about how to do that, and what both the opportunities and limitations of are using census. But definitely census is almost always how states fill in that gap for number 3. The trick is going to be integrating it with the first 2 at the child level. The other alternative is that if a state has a master person index, an MPI, there's various ways of talking about this, then you could potentially leverage that. But so far we haven't seen a state really be able to leverage that. I think there's always been efforts out there, but yeah. So you're absolutely right. The census is the way to go. From what we find other states do, you just again, it's the devil's in the details in terms of integrating it and making sure that you understand what, again, the opportunities and limitations of that is. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Do you have any other questions or comments?
I'll monopolize Allison if you let me.
Go ahead, Mandy.
What's the timeline for this? I thought that you all were going to put this together, that there was going to be some type of reporting in January. Is that still the case, or what is the timeline?
The timeline will be that, yeah, we're expecting this report to be ready in January. And we will be publishing it alongside our ECIDS roadmap. And I don't know why I called you Mandy, Kirsten. You sound like her.
I thought you were calling me ma'am, and I was like, why are you calling me ma'am? Thank you.
Sure. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, with that, thank you, Ross, Chris, and Derek for your time and for sharing that with us. And we look forward to sharing the final product.
Yeah,
thank you
so much.
Thanks. Okay, so moving on with our agenda. Next, we're going to walk through those business cases that we've discussed. So just one thing to note, and it's kind of come up a little bit here in this conversation, we have changed the terminology. We're no longer calling these use cases, we're now calling them business cases. Use cases often has like a more technical connotation, and We think that business case aligns better with the Texas Department of Information Resources that kind of provides oversight and frameworks for technical projects. So trying to line up with that seemed like a good idea. And I think there was also feedback in our last work group meeting that it made sense to adjust that. So what I'm going to just step you through here today is some additional work we've done to develop the foundational policy questions, and specifically the policy question on school readiness. So this is what we'll be focusing on as business cases to include in the recommendations in the roadmap. And what we're thinking would be sort of that first phase or first step in the roadmap, what we're recommending, the state might consider doing first. So with that, I think we can move to the next slide. So since we are, talking about school readiness, these are the programs that we would be looking to prioritize in the ESIDS roadmap. I think these are, pretty self-evident here: public school pre-K, early childhood special education. So that's part B. Also part C, early childhood intervention, childcare financial assistance. So that's our subsidy program. And then the prevention and early intervention programs from DFPS. We can go to the next slide. So this slide is outlining the functionality and data access and frequency of data updates that we are anticipating recommending in the roadmap. So, do note that this is not going to be like a real-time interactive system, that this will be most likely something that gets updated annually, quarterly. Really, the updates will depend largely on the data sets. Some of them lend themselves to less frequent, for instance, your public preschool data, public pre-K data is probably going to makes the most sense on an annual basis. Whereas childcare subsidy data, we might want to update quarterly since that's how we report it. Any questions on this slide or the ones I've already covered? No. Okay. Got a quiet bunch this afternoon, which I don't know if any of you were on the commission meeting this morning, but this is like the opposite. We had like 25 public commenters this morning. So, okay. Moving on to the next slide, foundational questions. So these next two slides focus on those foundational questions and provide some specific actions that we would expect to be possible if we do pursue setting up an ESIDS. So one of the big ones would be being able to provide an unduplicated count of the children in the state that are being served by one or more of these programs. So we know that this is a big challenge. It's a limitation that we cannot do right now. So then if we go to the next slide, second one here would be, to take a little deeper dive of which programs those children are enrolled in, which services they're receiving. And to also move towards being able to identify children that are eligible for services, but not necessarily receiving them, and sort of all the different ways you could slice and dice that, looking at all of the programs together. Any questions or comments on that? And Chelsea and Megan, feel free to jump in if I'm missing anything or forgetting to say anything. All right, next slide. Okay. So this slide is showing you how answering those those foundational policy questions would impact stakeholders. So this is really like, what is the, you know, what is the value being delivered? What could we do with if we had this information? So in the case of the school readiness policy questions, it could help prioritize pre-K enrollment and partnership efforts, improve referral processes, and increase awareness around the inclusion assistance rate, which is a facet of the child care subsidy program that could increase funding available or, you know, services accessed by for children, young children with disabilities and developmental delays. Questions, comments on that one? Okay, moving right along. So this slide lines up with what we just saw in 3SI's data landscape. These are the specific data sets that we would need to consider in order to answer these foundational questions. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Again, we kind of looked at this a bit in the 3SI presentation, but we've, you know, essentially I identified which ones we would need to tap into. And just as a reminder that ESID's roadmap wouldn't have us out of the door tapping all of these data sets at once necessarily. So just want to kind of caveat with that, that this would likely be a more iterative process. But these would be, you know, systems that we would look at prioritizing. Okay, next slide. Okay, and here are, you know, specific actions that we think policymakers and agency staff would be able to take related to these school readiness policy questions. So having this data would enable these activities and hopefully result in better outcomes. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, and more just about the impact here, the impact to stakeholders. If agencies and, you know, policymakers were able to address those identified policy questions, these are some of the positive outcomes for our stakeholders and advocates out there. Any questions or comments? Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, so these are additional data sets that would be needed to address the school readiness policy questions. Again, these were also covered in the data landscape presentation. And, you know, you'll note that we're considering data sets that look both at child data as well as that program or provider level data. Any thoughts or questions on this one? Okay, let's move on. Almost done here. Oh, we are done. So before we move on to public comment, I just want to give you guys one more opportunity. If there's any, you know, overarching comments you have or questions related to the direction that we're headed here.
So I assume, Allison, from what you said, since our last meeting, you guys had a chance to kind of confer with the agency that kind of, so you feel like you have a good sense of what the requirements are there. There won't be any delays based on how they view these, the definitions here.
You mean in terms of publishing the roadmap? and the data
Um,
landscape?
Yeah, I thought there were some questions last time about how we integrate this, and I thought there was some approval process with the Department of, is it Information Resources?
Yeah, the Department of Information Resources. I don't think that, I mean, I think that we want to align with kind of what their expectations are, because eventually, if this becomes a major IT project, then it's to our benefit. Things will go more smoothly in establishing the project and getting approvals and that kind of thing, if we're sort of aligned with their practices. But I don't think that we're at a stage now where we're needing to ask for their permission or, yeah, we will, hopefully we will get there. But that's, after some decisions have been made at the agency level about, do they really want to pursue this? And if so, how is it going to be funded? And then, there will be follow on to that, depending upon how it's funded. It's probably something that's going to require capital budget authority for whatever agency or agencies are actually doing the IT work or, leading that. So I think there are a few steps before we actually have to get DIR to sign off, but it's good we're thinking about it now, because it will definitely make for a smoother process. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan for the public comment portion.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So we did not receive any public comment this round, but in general, as a reminder to everyone tuned in, you can always request, even live during the meeting, just by sending me an email to give public comment. So I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. So with that, wanted to ask if there are any announcements to share. I do have one to share since David Fagan isn't here. But the Texans Care for Children School Readiness Dashboard that we previewed back in our June meeting is actually live and available just in time for session. So do feel free to go check that out. The group will review the full ESIDS roadmap. You'll have opportunity to do that between January 5th through the 13th. And we are planning then to share out those final documents at the January 20th Texas Early Learning Council meeting. And of course, many of you are on that council. If you're not on that council, you're of course welcome to join as a public attendee to hear that presentation. Does anybody else from the work group have any announcements? Okay. Well, with that, I will wish you all a wonderful holiday. Stay warm this week. And we look forward to talking with you again in the new year. And so that I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. It is 1:46 p.m. Thank you all.
Thank you, Allison. Happy holidays to all of you.